Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for the third in our series of initiatives for the Million Cat Challenge. Return to Field, Animal Shelters and a New Approach to Healthy Unowned Cats. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Manager for Maddie's Institute. Our speaker tonight is Scott Trebetoski. Over the years, Scott has earned 5 Florida Animal Control Association Outstanding Agency of the Year awards as head of 2 agencies, one of which was Jacksonville Animal Care and Protective Services. There, in collaboration with community partners, he pioneered the first full-scale return-to-field program from a government shelter. Now he leads the charge at the Pet Resources Division of Hillsborough County, Florida. In his presentation, he will share his great achievements in reducing euthanasia and saving the lives of healthy, unowned cats. Before we start, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll ask questions during the presentation. Our speaker's presentation will be short, allowing for more time for questions, but don't hold them until the end. Questions asked in the last few minutes will probably not be processed in time for a response. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The green File widget contains the presentation handout and a printable certificate of attendance for people attending this live event. So be sure to download, save, and print. Scott, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you. I'd like everyone to know that I've got my contact information on this first slide, both my email and my phone. So anytime after this presentation, feel free to contact me. I'm pretty good about getting back with emails. Phones I'm a little bit slower on, but please feel free to contact me with any questions you have along the way. While return to field might be new to some of you, it actually has been being practiced for about 7 or 8 years now in full scale in Jacksonville, where I worked with some of the not-for-profits and the community to get it kind of up and off the ground. But if you look at our first slide here, you'll see that I've got kind of a broad cross-section here. We've got it working in California, Florida, which is Jacksonville, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, and then we've got Texas. And I could have had more examples on here. These are just ones that kind of showed a cross-section, as well as kind of that southern area where people say it's a lot harder to get things done. One thing I want to tell you is I try to be real open and honest, so if I offend anybody, it's not that I'm trying to, it's just that I am kind of blunt, and as I'm getting older, I don't have much for softening the blow. So here we're going to launch right into the discussion of why are we talking about return to field? Why is there a new approach? And the reason it's a new approach is because the traditional models that we're used to have really failed. The traditional animal control model would be trap and remove. Some people would call it catch and kill. That resulted typically in 90% plus euthanasia in most shelters. In both of the shelters that I worked in prior to return to field, we had 90% euthanasia, and we were seeing an increase in cats every year. So it clearly wasn't working. What ended up happening was you have a lot of feral cats that we all understood were wild and just couldn't be done anything. Then we had a lot of semi-social cats that we just couldn't put up for adoption, but we knew they weren't really wild cats either. So that's where a lot of the euthanasia came in. One of the things that is really exciting, and it kind of, I think, is the future here for our research, is I've been doing some recent study reading on opportunistic predators like coyotes and some of those wild animals, because I think the cats will kind of mirror that. And they were showing that even if they cull 30% of these predators out of their herd, the actual population increases to try to offset that. And I think that's what we were experiencing all these years when we were doing the traditional trapping and removal. In fact, when I was in Lee County when I first started my career, I felt like we weren't doing a good enough job trapping them. So we enlisted volunteers and had a number of ways to try to get more and more animals into the shelter to try to clear the groundworks, I guess, for all the cats in the community, and that didn't work, and that kind of played into my change when I moved to Jacksonville. Being a equal opportunity offender here, I'm going to also tell you that the traditional approach of animal welfare, which is trapping, spay and neuter, and creation of colonies, and often relocation and creation of new colonies, also didn't work. This really resulted in a lot of cases in large nuisance colonies, and this is why animal control gave such a backlash. The problem was animal control was being called out constantly for these massive nuisance dumping of food, 10 cats on people's cars, the things that people really didn't want to see. So this new approach sort of takes away that part of the traditional TNR model as well. And one of the remnants we have, and anybody who's listening in the audience from both sides, but especially from the animal control side, is that there's this long history of people frustrated with cats and people frustrated with big colonies, and we've got to overcome that and explain how this new approach will ultimately end up reducing the number of animals coming through the shelter, and ultimately reducing the numbers of cats dying in our communities. So when we look at this program, we look basically at why return to field works. Once people are committed to the return to field concept, or the community is, I think you get a lot more open discussion. Animal control can talk about education, about nuisance abatement. We can talk about the right ways to do things, the wrong ways to do things, and be seen as both the educator as well as the compliance officer. The return to field concept that we used in Jacksonville is one that was very decentralized. And so instead of having maybe hundreds of people with large groups of cats, we enlisted thousands of people to have just a few cats in their yard. And I would tend to say for myself, and probably a lot of people I've talked to, I don't mind if the neighbor's got 2 or 3 cats they might be feeding. It may not be exactly what I like, but I can live with it. But on the other side, if I had 50 cats living next to me, I would have a really, really big problem with that, because I know what kind of nuisance and smells and all those issues. And that's why we're trying not to emphasize bigger colonies. In fact, we're trying to get away from big colonies into backyard people taking care of just a small handful, 4 or 5 cats at the most, and going from there. The other thing return to field does is it doesn't create that whole wildlife vacuum effect where when you pull animals out of there and you leave the resources, other animals come in, increase births, and then you sort of create this vicious cycle of new and more animals coming in. One of the big problems that we face from the animal control side is that TNR has been going on, will be going on, is going on in your communities, but it's really an underground thing if you're not doing return to field, or you've not, reached out to people and saying it's an acceptable practice. And then we don't have the opportunity to educate. Once you say we're going to do this, we can kind of get these above board. I've also been able to very successfully in the 2 communities I've worked in, been able to get some self-policing. So when one colony caregiver or one return to field caregiver knows that someone else isn't doing it right, they know that the best thing to do is to try to work to resolve that. They don't want to see the program fail because of a handful of people who aren't doing it right. And so you actually get some support from the same people that prior to return to field might have been, quote unquote, your enemies or your adversaries. The other thing you find is that once you start doing this, there are a lot more resources that are out there from animal welfare agencies. There are people in your community who are willing to donate. There are people in your community who are willing to actually get out and do some of this spay and neutering, and it doesn't have to necessarily fall upon you as the government. Some of the challenges, though, I think we face are pretty universal as well. And some of the challenges I know we're all facing right off the top is public policy and public officials and getting over that hurdle. And a lot of times I think we have not communicated the right way if you're not getting through to the politicians. And one of the things that politicians may not care about, and I hate to say it that way, but they may not care about you talking about your big heart and how you want to save the animals' lives and whatever. But if you change that over and you start talking to how it's going to save them money and save them long-term costs in animal control and things like that, that's where I think you start getting them to take notice. How is this going to reduce the phone calls to their offices? Huge thing they hate. They hate complaints coming to their offices. So find ways to sell it as how is it going to be good for them as politicians? How is it going to get them votes? That's really what public officials, especially elected public officials, are all about. The veterinary community, believe it or not, can sometimes be one of your biggest foes. Sometimes you can have advocates, and I've had strong advocates that have helped me along the way, and I've had community veterinarians who have been probably the biggest foes, and there are different reasons for it. There are some veterinarians who believe that it's not medically sound. However, these animals, we're not talking about putting new animals back into the community. We're talking about the ones that are already out there. So my feeling is if we get them in and we sterilize them and we give them their initial shots and we cull out some of these ones that are unhealthy, we have actually improved the health of the cat community, because the other alternative would be to do nothing. Because trapping and removing them just means another cat's going to fill its space. Audubon inverters, obviously being in Florida, that's not something that we've not reached as challenges here. I can tell you in Jacksonville we were remarkably able to deal with a land manager of a national seashore, a birding seashore, and we were able to work with them and actually get them to agree that we could work together. They put up some cat netting to stop the cats from coming in. We tried to keep all of the people within a general few blocks from there to not do the community cat management that close to their property. And we never really had the big uproar that we've seen in some other communities. PETA is pretty active in publicly shooting down this whole community cat thing. They would rather see them trapped and euthanized, but I don't think that that's always as big a challenge, because when you're dealing with public officials, a lot of public officials probably don't have the world's greatest opinion of PETA to begin with, so I don't think they've made a lot of inroads with the public policymakers. They have made inroads with some of the animal welfare people. There's also a really strong split. I would say it's almost a 50-50 split with public health officials. Some health officials, and the ones that I've been very lucky to deal with, kind of take the attitude of, look, if we're at least getting some vaccination against rabies into these animals, it's better than none at all. And I think that's probably the best way to look at it. Others will say, well, if you look at the number of animals, cases of rabies, cats are probably in the top 2 or 3, probably the top domestic animal. And really that is because of the quantity of cats that are out there. But we've been very good working with public health. We still have to be conscious of their job is to really deal with the transmittal of disease. So it's very sensitive. Should a cat come back positive, you really need to work with them to address the pocketed issue. But it's no different. In Florida, we have a huge population of rabid raccoons, and it's really not a whole lot different than dealing with other rabies issues in your communities, whether it's foxes, skunks, bats. There's a lot of different rabies issues, and I don't really see cats being a greater threat than any of the others. The next thing is perceived legal issues, and the reason I use the word perceived is that a lot of times people assume, or there's a history, or there's a folklore of this being an illegal thing to do, to take a cat from the community and put it right back where you got it after you've sterilized it. And a lot of times believe it or not, the laws aren't there. And the wildlife laws people are trying to use as means to say that they don't want you doing this. Often when you go to the wildlife, people are quick to jump back and say, well, wait a second, these wildlife laws are not directed towards cats. So again, you've got to look at that a little bit closely, and that's something that sometimes asking the question, because at least if you ask the question to the right official, you know where you're starting from. So one of the challenges you also have that kind of falls in that perceived legal issue is you've got a lot of your officers who are going to feel like, my job is not to keep animals in the field. My job is to bring them in, to, I don't care if they're going to be euthanized. My job is to pick up all the strays in the field. And that can be very challenging. I had a very conservative organization, and I really had to kind of push from the top down on them as far as the direction we were going when we did the pilot program for our community cat program. And what you have to do is kind of encourage those guys who are the early adopters and the ones that will really say, I get this, but how do we get the message out? And then you just have to keep working at it, because that is a great way when you can turn your officers into advocates. That's when your community has really made that turnaround. And that kind of bleeds into the next part, though. Publicity sometimes can actually hurt you when you're starting the program. When we made the move in Jacksonville, it was a public policy decision that was made by administration and backed by city council. So it was pretty much a done deal as far as politics went. However, we thought the greatest thing in the world would be to get out and educate the whole public, and all that did was create a lot of negative perceptions, a lot of things that we had to overcome because of all this folklore and things like that. So we actually kind of shifted back a little, and we sort of took the approach of not proactively telling people, but we would answer their questions until we had a chance to have a couple years of statistics under our belt, because we really didn't have other communities to point to. And that's the fortunate thing. If you're looking at starting this now, it's one of the places that you have an advantage that I didn't, is that there are some communities you can look at and you can say, look at, it's working in 5 or 6 of these different communities. You hear a lot of our community is different. Every community is different, but that doesn't mean you can't do this program in a certain way that fits your community. The one thing I want to emphasize, the last thing on this slide, is don't eliminate rules for own cats. This isn't a free-for-all. This isn't anarchy for cats. This is simply a program to deal with a segment of the cats, and those are the cats that are currently living outdoors, deemed unowned, or being cared for by multiple people in a lot of.
Excuse me, Scott, can I jump in here for a second?
Sure.
I'd like to encourage the people out there in the audience to get your questions in. We're going to be wrapping up Scott's presentation and would like to answer some of your questions. So please get them in now. I appreciate it. Thanks, Scott.
No problem. So now the one thing I wanted to look at were, what are some of the benefits of return to field? And one of the things when we're talking about return to field, the definition that I commonly use is any cat that came into the shelter in a trap is eligible for our return to field if it is healthy and thriving. Because it came in a trap, whether it's social, unsocial, semi-social, doesn't really matter. These are cats that have been living in the community. If they're healthy and thriving, that means there are resources out there. Do we need to know who's giving them the resources? Not really. What we need to do is make sure that they're healthy. If they're unhealthy, they need to come out and not go back into the community. If they test positive for a contagious disease or something, we can't put them back out with a contagious disease in good conscience either. But what we can do is realize that a lot of people have been dealing with outdoor cats longer than they've been dealing with the concept of indoor cats. And some people's tradition has been that they own an outdoor cat or they own an indoor and outdoor cat. And we've struggled for years and years trying to get everybody to bring their animals in, and it doesn't always work. So this is sort of a way to allow them to function without creating a bigger problem. I know there's one study out there, and I wish I had the exact citation for you, but I'm sure we could find it, that says that let's say you have a friendly cat that comes in a trap and you spay and neuter it and tip its ear and you put it back out, it has a 16 times more likely to get back to its home than if you put it in your shelter and you relied upon that owner coming to your shelter to look for it. That's pretty substantial. So again, let's look quickly at some of the benefits, and then we'll go quickly over what happened in Jacksonville, and then I'll get to your questions. I want to give you enough time for a bunch of questions. So one of the things that you commonly see after you've got return to field in operation is you start seeing a lower intake of cats on an annual basis, as well as lower euthanasia. And part of that reason is I think a lot of the officers, especially the guys who are actually out in the field, will tell you, I took cats from that person last year. I keep trapping on their land. I keep doing this. I keep doing that. And so it basically is repetitive customers. The same people are getting new cats, and you're not getting to the bottom of the problem. If they're going to keep getting cats, probably better just to let them keep a set, the same set that are sterilized and not producing more offspring. You have a less of a need for housing. In a lot of shelters, there is actually a holding period for a feral cat whose fate is ultimately going to be euthanized. And so we're bringing in cats, taking care of them for a day, 2 days, 3 days, sometimes longer, knowing that their ultimate fate is going to be euthanasia. So we've created this massive amount of housing to handle these animals. When you're doing return to field, ideally you're returning these animals to field as quickly as possible. So they're coming in one day, having surgery the next day, and returning to the field the next day. So that's a lot of saved time and space. And sometimes they don't actually have to come into the shelter, or they come into the shelter for a very short time and then are transferred to a partner agency. We have actually experienced shortages of cats for adoptions during slow times. In Florida, where I've done most of my work, we kind of have a bell curve. In the winter months, intake's pretty low. In the summer months, it's astronomical. And we have run into, in Jacksonville, I actually had to go out to cat rescues and ask them to bring cats in December and January because I couldn't keep my cages full, and I didn't want the public to believe that the problem was gone because we knew the problem was right around the corner in March or April. We actually saw a substantial number of reduced nuisance calls once we started spay and neutering and returning because we were having less of the nuisance behaviors, the cat fights, the noise, which is actually in most cases just breeding and things going on at night that people hear and it's not a pleasant sound to them. The cats weren't wandering as far because they weren't in the desire to mate because we took care of that. A lot greater goodwill from those of you in public sheltering who have lived through being the devil incarnate and all of the nasty things they said. People will actually start to see you as part of the solution rather than being, in their mind, part of the problem. And employee morale, if you reduce massive amounts of euthanasia and you don't have staff that have to constantly see cats coming in knowing they're going to go straight to euthanasia, morale goes up and your employee retention goes up. Now I'm going to run real quickly through what we experienced in Jacksonville, and I'm going to shoot a little example of how that benefited, and then we're going to go to your questions. So Jacksonville, for those of you who've not been there, very conservative, deep south community. We used to joke it's actually southern Georgia and not part of Florida. It's a very, if you want to talk about you got to get it done in the south, Jacksonville's a place that is as south gets. We had high euthanasia, numbers were well above 90% euthanasia. In 2007 alone, we euthanized more than 10,000 cats in 1 year alone. More than 10,000 cats were euthanized in Jacksonville. The one good thing Jacksonville had is they did have a low-cost spay-neuter program that began about a decade before we started this Return to Field program. The program started kind of in a almost comical manner where the not-for-profits and some of the animal welfare people went to an engineer, an environmental engineer who was temporarily over animal control and said, hey, you know, we're putting a lot of money into these cats that are already sterilized and ear-tipped. If you see an ear-tip, can you return the cats to us? Well, that engineer, not being at all in the animal field before, really had no preconceptions, did some of his own research, and he came back and said, look, if it's good for some of them, why isn't it good for all of them? So our new policy is we're going to take all of our cats that come in that are feral and trapped, and we're going to transfer them over to you animal welfare organizations. You're going to sterilize them, and you're going to put them back into the community. I imagine that the animal welfare organizations just about turned 18 shades of white and passed out when they heard that. But the good thing is they said, okay, we're up for the challenge. And working as a group, we all found a way to do it. They found funding, we found ways to cooperate together, and ultimately it became an all-in. We went from no cats going out one day to all the cats going out. That first year alone in Jacksonville, we put over 5,300 cats back into the community once they were sterilized. One of the things we did is work on gathering statistics and really trying to track it because we wanted to prove this either worked or didn't work, but we wanted it to be trackable so that we could go back to the politicians and show them that it was working or it wasn't. Uniformity of message was really big, and it was sort of fell on my shoulders.
What are ways in which you dealt with backlash from community members who did not want these cats in their neighborhoods? Period.
I've had to face this. We have a TNR program called Operation Catnip in Gainesville, and we neuter about 3,000 cats a year directly for the public. But we also started a Return to Field program with our local municipal shelter, so we've dealt with both kinds of TNR. And in our experience, when we take the time to go out and meet an angry citizen and find out what it is about the cats that's bothering them, we can usually talk them off the edge, ask them to give us a chance to mitigate the nuisance, and usually there is some actual nuisance that they have a right not to have in their yard. And they're often very surprised that someone cares and that someone's willing to work with them. We always say give us a chance to do the neutering first because that eliminates so much of the nuisance, and that if it doesn't, we'll be back and talk about next steps. We have also rehabilitated nuisance attractants such as openings under someone's house that's allowing the cats to go in there and foul the area. We bought someone a truck cover because his fancy truck was getting cat prints on it. And so most of the time, if you can put a friendly, helpful person in front of an angry citizen, you can resolve the problem. It's not 100%, but it's surprising how often it works.
Thank you. By the way, Dr. Julie Levy from the University of Florida is taking over the questions until we can get Scott back. So let's go with another. Oh, good, Scott. Nice to have you back. I hope everybody in the audience stayed with us through this little glitch. But here's another question, and I guess probably both of you could answer this, or Scott. How do you deal with cats that are owner surrendered but not suitable for adoption due to behavior issues?
We actually do not allow owner-surrendered animals to go back into the Return to Field program. So if they are owner-surrendered and they're unsuitable for adoption due to behavior and other issues that can't be corrected, we ultimately have to euthanize those animals. We don't have any alternative. We do not return an animal that did not live outdoors originally to the outdoors. So if someone own this cat and they no longer want it and they say, you know, it's kind of a nasty cat, we won't put it out into the Return to Field program.
Okay, great. So let's take another question. What sort of cost did the shelter endure as a result of this program?
Well, we were very fortunate to have partners, so our shelter actually did not have any additional cost. This took place in Jacksonville in 2008 when the economy was really kind of hitting the skids. Real estate in Florida was crashing. So our not-for-profits probably kicked in somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 the first year through grants and other funding resources they had in order to get this program off and running. As time went on, the county began to pick up a bigger chunk of that money. We never picked up all of the money, but we were able to share some of the costs because we were actually starting to save costs on care, feeding, housing, and things like that. So ultimately, it never cost the county any more money, although as a community as a whole, it probably cost us about $250,000 to get it up and running. And then we started to see the reduction in cost, the reduction in the need for food and staff and things like that. So we ultimately saved money, but initially we didn't. So I'm going to go back to the slide because I don't know when I dropped. Here's at a glance what happened in Jacksonville. So you can see our numbers the year before the program up until 2013. So the year before the program was 2007. We were euthanizing about 88.6, about 90% of the cats. That accounted for about 12,000 of the euthanasia in our community. That dropped to 8.5% in 2013, and the cat intake began to drop dramatically as we were not constantly recapturing the same people's cats and euthanizing them. One of the things that I think is really remarkable, and no one really would have thought this was going to happen, but initially when we started, the spay and neuter cost, the cost of this program was being borne about 90% by the shelters and the not-for-profits that we were working with. And private people taking them to their own veterinarian was only accounting for what we estimated to be about 10%. By 2013, that had drastically shifted to where the community was picking up the lion's share by people raising their own money, going to their own vets. So this actually increased business to the veterinary community because people were actually going to the private vets and having these animals sterilized. So it became a 30-70 split. The bottom line for that last question, you can look at the bottom. Our budget in 2007 was about $5.6 million with 72 employees. Ultimately, just before I left and came to Hillsborough County, we were down to a $3.3 million budget with 38 employees. And a lot of that was due to several changes, but a good chunk of that came from this return to field and the fact that we weren't caring for 12,000 cats that ultimately were being euthanized, or 10,000 of the 12,000 were ultimately being euthanized.
Very good. That's an excellent explanation, and I'm glad you went back to that slide, Scott, because, yes, we did miss it. So let's take the next question. How do you deal with municipal facility, for instance, a public school, that wants feral cats off their property?
In both of the communities that I've worked, we have rules that do not allow for community cats or feral cats to be on public property. You know, it's not a perfect system, but we discourage anybody from maintaining a colony or any feeding sites on school grounds, public parks, or any government installations. And that is because it is a public property. There are issues that we don't want to create negativity when people are trying to share a park or deal with things like that. And it's worked very effectively. There's plenty of other property in your community, so we actually have rules that exclude cats from municipal property or government property in general.
Excellent. I've got another question. I'm going to read it, but there's an additional one next to it that I would like to combine your answer. What do you do if there's a cat leash law in your community and you want to return to field, and then also Did you have to deal with stray hold requirements for ferals trapped, brought in? Many people complain that their local ordinances will not allow for this.
Those are two really good questions, and the way we dealt with the whole leash law, the requirements for owned cats, we still have them. They still have them in Jacksonville. I still have them in Hillsborough. What we're looking at is a very distinct subset of cats. These are cats that live outdoors, that have no owner, that are being cared for often by multiple people, that are not generally thought of by these people as being owned cats. And we say if the cat is sterilized, vaccinated, and ear-tipped, it's a community cat, and that cat is somewhat exempt from certain licensing requirements and leash laws and things like that. But if you own a cat, our goal ultimately is to get every cat into people's homes. That would be my ultimate goal before I leave this career, is that we have very few outdoor cats, and that the majority live in the house. But I think you've got to be pragmatic that there really are two subsets. One subset is that those that people own, that they keep in their house, they need to have the same requirements. We require licenses. We require them to be on the leash if they're outdoor. We will issue citations if they have ear-tipped cats that they're keeping outdoors. We have a very distinct set of rules of owned cats versus community cats. From a stray hold requirement, that sometimes becomes a very a policy-based one. And when I was in Jacksonville, when I first was hired there, we had a 3-day hold for feral animals. So we basically brought in these animals, shoved them in a 24 by 24-inch cage for 3 days, kind of poked food and stuff into the cage, hoped that our guys didn't get bit, and then turned around and euthanized them on massive scale. You know, as I say, in 2007, 10,000 cats were being euthanized. But when we went to the Board of County Commissioners and we said, look at what is the stray hold is for people to come and reclaim animals. And so we went and pulled stats, and in Jacksonville, I believe it was 0.8%. So less than 1% of cats were ever even being reclaimed. So when we moved forward to change the holding period on community cats that were feral and or unsocial / semi-social, the Board of County Commissioners didn't have a problem. And sometimes what you do, and this is what I did in Hillsborough, is in order to drop that holding period, we say if the cat does come in with identification, it's microchipped, it has a collar, it's clearly an owned animal, we'll hold it for a longer period, knowing that hopefully that owner will come in and get it. So it's sort of a balance of saying, look, no one's ever coming in for these cats, but the ones that people might come in for, maybe we can hold them a little bit longer if you drop this holding period.
Okay, thank you. Here's our next question. How have other return-to-field programs combated city ordinances specifically about abandonment free-roaming cats?
A lot of the return-to-field programs that I've seen, and I've dealt with people in California, in New Mexico, and Texas, Indiana, Ohio, and maybe a handful of others, it's a matter of a city ordinance or a county ordinance is basically local policy, local law. And so you've got to start educating the officials who have the ability to change those laws and rules. And one of the things I think that's really a bad misnomer about return to field is this whole abandonment thing. If you take an animal from the field, have it for roughly a day or two in order to sterilize and return it, why is that considered abandonment when your alternative was you could have turned your back on that animal and it would have been the same? A lot of people, I've heard people in my field call it re-abandonment. These animals, in a lot of cases, are multi-generationally living outdoors. We don't know who abandoned them. We don't know who put them out in the field in the first place. Some of them aren't. Some of them are newly put out there. But the bottom line is we're not advocating adding any new animals to the community. What we're doing is trying to find a fix for this subset of animals in order to let them live the most humane life without creating additional problems, and hopefully over time seeing less and less outdoor cats.
Thank you. Here's the next question. Dr. Levy, you may want to jump in on this one. We've been doing return to field for 3 years, and we've saved almost 1,000 cats. The shelter we work with requires that they are combo tested. I think cats should be returned with FIV, as that is not highly transmissible. Your thoughts?
I actually agree with this comment that FIV in a neutered cat is very unlikely to be transmitted because it's transmitted primarily by bite wounds. And after cats are castrated, they really become very docile and rarely fight. I think there needs to be a strong consideration about why to invest in testing at all, especially if investing in testing is decreasing the number of cats that can be neutered. So we should test if we're going to do something with the results of that test, but if it's not going to drive a reaction of some kind, then we shouldn't divert our resources to testing. We know we can help more cats by increasing the number of cats that we neuter, and we know we can slow down the spread of these diseases by neutering more cats as well. So I am in the camp of not testing on a routine basis for return to field programs, and especially for FIV.
Okay.
And if I can chime in a little bit on this one too, one of the things, before I came into this industry, I was in private business and I was in for-profit business. And one of the things that I find interesting that's not talked about when it comes to combo testing. So, and I know these numbers are probably not accurate, but we're using them for illustration. So let's say the combo test cost us $15 per cat to test, and maybe two animals out of 100 are coming back positive. We're not ultimately paying $15 per animal. We're ultimately paying like $750 for everyone that comes back positive. And is that cost benefit really there to be testing everything when ultimately most of these animals are not going to be highly transmittable risks, even if they did have FIV and they were neutered and returned to the community?
Okay, thanks, Scott and Dr. Levy. Here's a good question. Which community models should I review that are good examples to bring this program to our community? Other than Jacksonville, of course. That is the good model. Any others that you can suggest?
San Jose has a good program, and John Cicerelli over there, is very good about talking and answering questions. I know they've got a program in Albuquerque. They've got a program in Waco, Texas. There are quite a few that are out there. I think what you probably want to do is look at a bunch of them and look at communities that have similar makeups, and you're probably not going to be able to take one just off the shelf, but pick and choose the pieces that fit your community the best.
Okay, thank you. So here's a good one for you, Scott, and directed right at you. Scott, how are you dealing with the mission, the Hillsborough HAHF vets want to do away with the TNR and speak against it, making it difficult for TNR caregivers, and to promote responsible community and government participation and support?
Well, that definitely was a challenge. When I came to Hillsborough County, and I may not get this just right, but I think it's the Hillsborough Animal Health Foundation is what that stands for, and that's run by a number of community vets. And we sat down and we had literally some knockdown, drag out, yelling and screaming type meetings over their objection to return to field and some of their claims that I think they couldn't necessarily show me statistical information, and they would say, well, it's common sense that this would happen. Ultimately, what this community ended up doing in Hillsborough was working with the veterinarians to create a pilot program. And that pilot program was not what I perhaps would have considered the ideal program, but it worked, and it was a starting place in this community. And what we did is the community said, look, we'll meet you part way. Each side's not going to get what it wants exactly, but let's start doing it, and let's start getting the cats out into the community. I have had a number of conversations with that group since. I've had numbers of conversations independently with some of the members of that group, and I think as they're starting to see the program and the horror stories are not coming to fruition, that we are out dealing with nuisances. That's the other thing I want to tell our enforcement people. Look, if there are legitimate nuisances out there, you still have, that's your job to deal with that. But a legitimate nuisance is not just because somebody doesn't like a cat. If the community is having problems with a cat or several cats, you need to go out and deal with it. The fact that you have a cat hater that lives next to someone who's taking care of cats, that's not a legitimate problem. But I really think that we have forged some pretty good working relationships with that group here in Hillsborough. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think most people in our community would say the life of community cats is probably better than it was a year ago, and definitely a lot better than it was 2 years ago.
Excellent. Thank you. Here's another question. How do we come up with funding to do spay-neuter of the community cats that we pull from the shelters? We have several 501c3 rescues. Our Humane Society and our SPCA are on board here in Brevard County, Florida, and we finally have the go-ahead from the shelters.
I think, when we were looking at it, we were kind of the new kids on the block, and we were a novelty, and it was probably a little bit easier to get some of the seed money. I think you may not be able to find all the money in one big chunk. I think you may have to go out and look at piecing together several small grants. I think you need to put it out to your animal welfare community, the people who have been long advocates of this to, help you raise that money, whether it's through a private spay-neuter or who it is that can help. I have been in Brevard County, and I appreciate that you've got a lot of challenges there, but I think you got to start somewhere and start doing the spay-neuter of these cats, pulling them from the shelters and getting them back directly to where they came, and not relocating them and not having pockets of big colonies. And I think as the public sees the change, you'll see more willingness to contribute. I think there is kind of a two-way street here. You got to get the money in order to show the results, but you got to show the results in order to get the money. So it is difficult, and don't think you may be able to get it all in one piece. You may have to kind of piece several together.
Thank you, Scott. Is R2F basic, which is return to field, basically another name for TNR, trap, neuter, return? If not, what are the differences?
The difference that I see between traditional TNR and return to field is a couple-fold. Traditional TNR dealt with colonies, often knowing where the colonies were, sometimes having registered colonies, some things like that, where the cats were typically truly feral or pretty darn close to feral, and everybody would agree on that. Return to field is a much broader concept that doesn't really want to emphasize colonies, especially not big colonies, but we want it to be decentralized. People taking care of 2 cats, 3 cats in their backyard, putting out just enough food for them, trying to change how people care for the cats. Also, return to field often has broader parameters. We put semi-social cats, those cats that are arguably, are they feral, aren't they feral? Well, we don't know because they fall somewhere in between, but we know we can't adopt them because they're mean enough not to be adopted. Those sometimes didn't get counted in old TNR programs. In a really broad application of return to field, which is what we matured to ultimately in Jacksonville, was if it came in a trap and it was healthy and it was thriving, it went back regardless of its temperament, which meant even friendly cats sometimes went back into these communities, provided they were healthy, they weren't declawed or anything like that would be a problem for them, because ultimately we knew these cats were more likely to find their way back home. So I think return to field is a next generation of TNR, but it's not simply renaming TNR. It is actually a different concept. And typically return to field in the communities that are really thriving in it actually sometimes begins in the government as opposed to beginning in the animal welfare field.
So here's a related question, Scott. How does return to field work logistically? Is the trapper responsible for picking up the cat after sterilization to return to the field, or is it up to your staff?
That's a good question, and I am familiar with 3 different methods of this. So I'm going to tell you about 3 different ways that this is done. In Jacksonville, the animals would come to the shelter. First Coast No More Homeless Pets, which is a large spay-neuter clinic and animal welfare organization, would come and pick them up, sterilize them, and they would return them. So basically, the only thing the shelter did was take the animals in, and this other group did all the work. In Hillsborough County, we take the animals in, we drive them over to our animal welfare organization who does the majority of the work, which is the Tampa Bay Humane Society, and they then arrange to have the animals returned back to where they were picked up based on the information we provide them. The third scenario takes place down in Miami, where the animal control shelter brings in the animals, they sterilize the animals, and they return the animals themselves. So it can be done a lot of different ways.
Here's one on revaccinating for rabies. What are the requirements for that? Is this up to the county, or is it left to the responsibility of the individual group to retrap?
Retrapping and revaccinating is a challenge. It typically is up to whoever traps the animals. And this is one of those questions of, how often do you get an animal that's retrapped? We weren't seeing a lot of retrapping. And then, what's the process that you go about revaccinating? It's not a perfect system. Julie can probably chime in better on this, knowing she's been involved a lot with cat groups prior to even this return to field and the challenges that we've probably had for decades when it comes to rabies. So Dr. Levy, if you could chime in.
Sure. My recommendation is to vaccinate all cats in the U.S., except in Hawaii, with a 3-year rabies vaccine. We know that 3-year rabies vaccine will work for 3 or more years, even though technically you can only write a 1-year certificate for that cat. So we benefit public health by vaccinating as many of these free-roaming cats against rabies as we can. In our program, we actually provide free booster vaccines. So if they bring the cat, an ear-tipped cat, back in a trap, we'll just vaccinate it through the side of the trap and send it away. I think the challenge from a public health point of view is if that cat were to injure someone, could you really prove which black feral cat it was? And if they're not microchipped, I would probably not trust my life to a caregiver's memory of the cat's vaccination status. So we know we can make public health safer by vaccinating a lot of these cats, but we also know we're in conflict with a lot of the state laws that require boosters at a year and then every 3 years after that. But we're doing the best we can, and certainly improving the situation rather than harming it.
Great. Here's another really hard one. What are your best arguments against, well, maybe not against birders, but with birders?
Okay, I'll give you my my argument, my philosophical discussion when it comes to birders, and actually, you know, having lived for 20 years in Florida, I kind of consider myself enjoying all the birds and things that we see down here as well. But one of the things that I think is often lost in the emotion is the fact that we are not, and I will repeat this multiple times, we are not advocating putting new cats out in a return to field. These are animals that originated in the field, and these animals are being returned, and actually some of them don't actually make it back to the field because some of them we pull out and put into adoptions. Some of them we pull out because they're not healthy. So ultimately the number of cats that are returned to field is generally less than was there to begin with. So we're not putting birds at any greater risk than they were prior to us taking this animal in, sterilizing it, and putting it back out there. So it's not, the problems that birders may or may not have with cats is not affected positively or negatively to any great extent by having a return to field program. And ultimately, our goal is to start changing public perception of the need to care for them and to say, you know, our goal ultimately is a shared goal that you have, is to get fewer and fewer cats alive outside and most of them indoors. One thing I can always say is, you know, look back 40 or 50 years in this country, dogs used to be able to roam freely with no leash laws. We've changed that to where you rarely see dogs running loose in the grand scheme of things. That's really what we hope the next generation of cat care will be as well.
Very good. I'd like to let the audience know that we're going to run over just a little bit because we lost audio for there, so we're making up for the time that we lost. We'll take several more questions and then we'll end for the evening. So the next question is, do you monitor at all the care of the cats, the care that the cats are receiving who are returned to field?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question. I think from an animal control standpoint, most of the work we do is response to complaints from the field. So if somebody called in a complaint that they saw unhealthy cats, they saw huge accumulations, they saw people dumping piles, you know, bags of food, things that aren't allowed in our community, we definitely would respond. If we saw animals that weren't being properly cared for, we would address them whether they were owned animals or whether they were community cats. Do we keep some kind of a log or register of every cat that went out? No. Do we care to go out and monitor them if we're not getting complaints? No. We assume if there are no complaints, the animals are probably being properly cared for. But if we do get a complaint, we will definitely go out on it.
Thanks, Scott. Here's another question. We've had 2 people recently tell us that trap and kill has worked for them in the past. What is your rebuttal for this?
Well, I guess I would challenge them, and I'd love to see those stats. The only place that I know that has worked at all is in island-type communities where you have a very restricted ability for animals to get on and off the island, and therefore you have a finite pool of animals. But I will also tell you, even a finite pool of animals doesn't resolve the issue in some communities. When I was in Lee County, Fort Myers Beach was hit by Hurricane Charlie. The island went 3 feet underwater. Effectively, all of the cats, all of the feral cats, all the community cats on that island were either washed inland or died. So you effectively had no outdoor free-roaming cats in Fort Myers Beach. It was less than 2 weeks later that we were getting calls that people were trapping cats on the mainland and returning them to the beach. So you're dealing with people's behavior, and if people are wanting to care for the cats, they're going to find cats and they're going to replace cats that you're trapping and killing. I've tried aggressively trapping in Lee County, and our numbers of intake kept going up. I really don't think that unless you can eliminate the majority or all of the cats that are out there, trap and kill is going to work, except in a very finite island-type community.
Very good. Here's a question that you both may like to take a shot at. Living in a community with a very cold weather for half the year, what do you suggest we do during the winter months? And I've heard this argument before. Dr. Levy, I know you have too. Do you have something to say on this topic?
I do, and I really wish I could make an educated, intelligent comment, because I've worked in California and Florida and North Carolina where we rarely have really cold days, and we get questions from Minnesota and Quebec and very cold climates. And it comes down mostly, I think, to questions about whether you do surgery and release cats post-surgically in really cold weather and what that lower limit should be. Clearly a cat that's an adult and has made it through a winter once has figured out how to do it, so that's probably a safer animal to neuter in the winter. But if it is an extremely cold client, or if it's a female or a more intensive surgery, holding those cats inside a few days till the weather's a little bit warmer before releasing them would be a good idea. Probably stay away from neutering very young cats and frail cats during the coldest months. The other thing that comes up sometimes is how, for frostbite ears, how do you ear tip them? And that's another thing we never face in Florida, although sometimes we do have cats with oral hematomas. And what has been recommended that I think is interesting is go ahead and tip that frostbitten ear, but put some green tattoo ink in the cut, and at least that way it'll be recognized as an ear tip.
Yeah, and as far as my experience, I lived in Wisconsin for years and years, about 30 years before I moved to Florida, but honestly was not that interested in animal welfare at the time, so I really don't have the perspective. All I can tell you is I grew up in farming communities, and we had cats that survived the winter well, and if they're surviving it, you know, if you're able to sterilize them during the right time, during the right weather, ultimately a lot of those cats have found ways to survive bad winters. Obviously, Wisconsin's got some of the bad winters in this area, and we had plenty of community cats at that time as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll take this one last question, and then we'll move into our ending remarks here. How could this program work in a small community that has no vet on staff at the animal shelter?
Well, I'll take first shot at this, and Dr. Levy might actually be able to give more information. But I think it's a matter of, in a small community, you need to kind of work with your community vets. And I think that's going to be a challenge because you're going to have fewer of them being in a small community or maybe your neighboring communities. Knowing that some vets are opposed to this type of program is going to be a challenge for you. But I also think that there are animal welfare organizations out there that might be able to help you, to give you some tips, to put you in contact with neighboring communities. When I was in Jacksonville, we were a giant city surrounded by a lot of small counties. Once we had our situation in control, we actually started reaching out to the smaller communities in order to pay it forward. And I would hope that that would be the model that we would see moving forward in this country, with the bigger cities reaching out to the smaller communities to help them solve. But maybe Dr. Levy has a couple of thoughts on this as well.
So I agree that the best choice is to develop a collaboration with a local veterinary practice if that's possible, being very respectful of the needs of that practice and not expecting it to be a charity. And then I really admire what was done in Jacksonville. First Coast is such a big spay-neuter program. They neuter 30,000 animals a year, and they have a huge transport component. So they send their truck out to our very rural surrounding counties and bring animals back to Jacksonville for neutering. So if you are near a metropolitan hub, I think a transport program would be the way to go. And then also look into mobile spay-neuter clinics. There might be one in your region that's willing to come once a week or once a month into your area for a day of TNR surgery.
Excellent. Very good. I want to remind the audience that there is a printable certificate of attendance in the green resource widget at the bottom of your screen. Please download that before we end for the evening. And Dr. Levy, I'd like to ask you to make some closing remarks.
These series of presentations by shelter managers who are actually in the field making the hard work happen has been very gratifying and inspiring for me, and this is certainly another step in that direction. Return to Field is one of the 5 key initiatives of the Million Cat Challenge. A lot of those of you who are signed up are already members of the Million Cat Challenge, but for shelters that either haven't heard of it yet or aren't sure they want to be part of it, please do visit our website at www.millioncatchallenge.org to see what it's about. It is a website that's bringing tools like this to shelters so they can save more cats. And we have a really fun program where shelters can sign up and report their data to us very securely, and we'll compile it all up in one big number towards our mission to save 1 million cats in North American animal shelters over the next 5 years. And you can see that number as it accumulates right on the front of our website.
Very good. Well, that's the end of our event. We want to thank Scott and Dr. Levy and all of you for your time tonight. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete our survey. Your feedback is important to us. Click on the link on your screen. If for some reason you don't see the link, it is also in the resource file at the bottom of your screen, and the link will be emailed to you in a few days. This webcast will be available on demand shortly, and we hope you will share this presentation on your social sites. We hope you can join us for the remaining 2 webcasts of the Million Cat Challenge key initiatives, which will help change the sheltering world. Thanks again for being here with us this evening. Good night.